The Gulag Archipelago, Part 7 continued. One MVD officer, my traveling companion on a Siberian train journey in 1962, described this whole era in the life of the camps until 1954 as follows. Things were completely out of hand. Those who didn't want to didn't even go to work. They bought television sets with their own money. He had retained very dark memories of that short but unpleasant period. For no good can come of it when his mentor stands before a prisoner like a suppliant, with neither whips nor punishment cells nor graded short rations to fall back on. But this was apparently still not enough. The next assault on the archipelago was a battering ram called the off-camp or living out system. Prisoners were allowed to move out of camp altogether. To acquire houses and families, they were paid wages like free men, and paid in full, with no more deductions for the upkeep of the camp, the guards, and the administration. The only remaining link to the camp was that once a fortnight they went in to report. This was the end of the world, or of the archipelago, or of both at once. But the organs of the law applauded the off-camp system as outstandingly humane, a pioneering discovery of the communist order. After these blows, there seemed to be nothing left but to disband the camps and to be done with it. To destroy the great archipelago, ruin, scatter, and demoralize hundreds of thousands of practical workers with their wives, children, and domestic animals. Make faithful service, rank, and an impeccable record things of no account. It seemed to have begun already. Something called Commissions of the Supreme Soviet, or more simply, unloading parties, began arriving at the camps, cold-shouldering the camp authorities, taking over the staff huts for their sessions, and writing out orders of release, as light-heartedly and irresponsibly as though they were warrants for arrest. A deadly threat hung over the whole cast of practical workers. They had to think of something. They had to fight. One of two fates awaits any important social event in the USSR. Either it will be hushed up, or it will be the subject of calumny. I can think of no significant event in our country which has slipped past the roadblock. So it was throughout the existence of the archipelago. Most of the time it was hushed up, and whatever was written about it was lies, whether in the days of the great canals, or about the unloading commissions of 1956. As far as these commissions were concerned, we ourselves, with no insidious prompting from the newspapers, under no pressure from the outside, assisted the work of sentimental falsification. Who would not be deeply moved? We were used to attack from our own lawyers, and now we saw public prosecutors taking our side. We pined for freedom. We felt that out there a new life was beginning. We could see as much even from the changes in the camps. And suddenly there came a miracle-working plenipotentiary commission which talked to each prisoner for 5 or 10 minutes. Then handed him a rail ticket and a passport. Some of them even registered for Moscow. What, except praise, could burst from the emaciated, chronically bronchitic, wheezy breaths of us prisoners? But what if we had risen for a moment above the happiness that set our hearts painfully pounding and ourselves running to stuff our rags into our duffel bags, and asked ourselves whether this was the proper ending to all of Stalin's crimes? Should not the commission have stood before a general lineup of prisoners, bared their heads, and said, "Brothers, we have been sent by the Supreme Soviet to beg your forgiveness. For years and decades you have languished here, though you are guilty of nothing, while we gathered in ceremonial halls under cut-glass chandeliers with never a thought for you. We submissively confirmed the cannibal's inhuman decrees, every one of them. We are accomplices in his murders. Accept our belated repentance if you can. The gates are open, and you are free. Out there on the airstrip, planes are landing with medicines, food, and warm clothing. There are doctors on board." Either way, they obtained their freedom, but this was the wrong way to confer it, a denial of its true meaning. The unloading commission was like a careful janitor following the trail of Stalin's vomit, and diligently mopping it up, that was all. This was no way to lay new moral foundations for our society. I am quoting in what follows the judgment of A. Skripnikova, with which I entirely agree. Prisoners are summoned one by one, as usual to keep them disunited, into the office where the commission sits. A few factual questions are asked about each man's case. The questions are perfectly polite and apparently well meant, but their drift is that the prisoner must admit his guilt. Not the Supreme Soviet, but the unhappy prisoner again. He must be silent, he must bow his head. He must be put in the position of one forgiven, not one who forgives. In other words, they want to coax out of him with the promise of freedom what previously they could not wring from him even by torture. Why, you may ask? It is most important. He must return to freedom a timid soul. And at the same time, the Commission's records will make it appear to history that those inside were, most of them, guilty, that the pictures of brutal lawlessness have been greatly overdrawn. There may have been a handsome financial benefit, too. Without rehabilitation, no compensation need be paid. If it meant no more than this, the release of prisoners held no dangers. It would not blow the whole camp system sky high. It created no obstacles to new admissions, which went on uninterruptedly even in 1956 through 1957, and no obligation to release the newcomers in their turn. What of those who, out of incomprehensible pride, refused to acknowledge their guilt to the Commission? There were quite a few of them. Unrepentant women prisoners in Dubrovlag in 1956 were rounded up and dispatched to Kemerovo camps. Shripnikova tells us of the following incident. One Western Ukrainian woman had been given 10 years because her husband was a supporter of Bandera. She was now called upon to admit that she was in because he was a bandit. "No, I won't say it." "Say it and you'll go free." "No, I won't say it. He's no bandit. He's in the OUN." "All right, if you don't want to go, you can stay," said Solovyov, chairman of the commission. A few days later, her husband visited her, on his way home from the north. He had been sentenced to 25 years, but he readily admitted that he was a bandit, and was pardoned. He showed no appreciation of his wife's staunchness, and heaped reproaches on her. "Why didn't you say that I was the devil himself? That you'd seen my tail and my cloven hoof? How am I going to manage the farm and the children now?" I should mention that Shripnikova herself refused to acknowledge her guilt, and remained inside another 3 years. So even the era of freedom came to the archipelago in a public prosecutor's gown. All the same, the alarm of the practical workers was not baseless. In 1955 through 1956, the stars over the archipelago were in a conjunction never seen before. These were fateful years for it, and might have been its last. If the people who were invested with supreme power, and weighed down with the fullness of their knowledge about their country had also been steeped in the doctrine of theirs, but believed in it genuinely and wholeheartedly, surely those years were a time for them to look back in horror and to sob aloud. How can they gain admittance to the kingdom of communism with that bloody sack at their backs? It oozes blood. Their backs are one great crimson stain. They have let out the politicals, but who or what has produced all those millions of non-political and non-professional criminals? Our relations of production? The social milieu? We ourselves? You, perhaps? They should have let their space program go to hell. Let Sukarno's Navy and Kwame Nkrumah's Guard regiments look after themselves. They might at least have sat down and scratched their heads. Where do we go next? Why are our laws, the best in the world, rejected by millions of our citizens? What makes them so ready to crawl under that murderous yoke? And the more intolerable it is, the more densely they flock to shoulder it. What must we do to stem the stream? Perhaps our laws are not what they should be. And here it would be worth thinking a little about the harassed schools, the neglected countryside, and all those things which we can only call injustices, with no class label. How are we to bring the fallen back to life? Not by cheap and facile gestures like the Voroshilov amnesty, but by a sympathetic effort to understand each of them, his case and his character. Should we put an end to the archipelago or not? Or is it there forever? For 40 years it has been an ulcer in our flesh. Isn't that enough? Evidently not. It is not enough. Nobody wants to tire the convolutions of his brain. There is no answering ring in the soul. Let the archipelago stand for another 50 years while we get on with the Aswan Dam and the unification of the Arabs. Historians attracted to the 10-year reign of Nikita Khrushchev, when certain physical laws to which we had grown accustomed suddenly seemed to stop operating, when objects miraculously began defying the forces of the electromagnetic field, defying the pull of gravity, will inevitably be astounded to see how many opportunities were briefly concentrated in those hands, and how playfully, how frivolously they were used before they were nonchalantly tossed aside. Endowed with greater power than anyone in our history except Stalin, a power which, though impaired, was still enormous, he used it like Krylov's Mishka, in the forest clearing, rolling his log first this way, then that, and all to no purpose. He was given the chance to draw the lines of freedom 3 times, 5 times more firmly, and he failed to understand his duty. Abandoned it as though it were a game, for space, for maize, for rockets in Cuba, for Berlin ultimatums, for persecution of the church, for the splitting of oblast party committees, for the battle with abstract art. He never carried anything through to its conclusion, least of all the fight for freedom. Stir him up against the intelligentsia? Nothing could have been simpler. Use his hands, the hands that wrecked Stalin's camps, to reinforce the camps now? That was easily achieved. And just think when. In 1956, the year of the 20th Congress, the first orders limiting relaxation of the camp regime were promulgated. They were extended in 1957, the year when Khrushchev achieved undivided power. But the caste of practical workers was still not satisfied. Scenting victory, they went over to the offensive. We can't go on like this. The camp system is the main prop of the Soviet regime, and it is collapsing. For the most part, their influence was of course brought to bear discreetly, at official banquets, in the passenger cabins of aircraft, at Dhaka boating parties. But their activities sometimes came out in the open, as for instance in B.I. Samsonov's speech at the session of the Supreme Soviet, December 1958. Prisoners, said he, live too well. They are satisfied with their food, whereas should be permanently dissatisfied. They are treated too well. In a parliament which had never acknowledged its earlier guilt, no one of course rebuked Samsonov, or in the article about "The Man Behind Bars," 1960. Yielding to this pressure without examining anything closely, without pausing to reflect that crime had not increased in those last 5 years, or that if it had, the causes must be sought in the political system, without considering how these new measures could be squared with his faith in the triumphal advance of communism, or attempting to study the matter in detail, or even to look at it with his own eyes, this Tsar, who had spent all his life on the road, lightheartedly signed the order for nails to knock the scaffold together again quickly, in its old shape and as sturdy as ever. And all this happened in the very year, 1961, when Nikita made his last expiring effort to tug the cart of freedom up into the clouds. It was in 1961, the year of the 22nd Congress, that a decree was promulgated on the death penalty in the camps for terrorist acts against reformed prisoners, in other words, stoolies, and against the supervisory staff, something which had never happened, and the plenum of the Supreme Court confirmed, in June 1961, regulations for 4 disciplinary categories in camps. Khrushchev's camps now, not Stalin's. When he climbed onto the Congress platform for another attack on Stalin's tyranny, Nikita had only just allowed the screws of his very own system to be turned no less tight, and he sincerely believed that all this could be fitted together and made consistent. The camps today are as approved by the party before the 22nd Congress. 6 years later, they are just as they were then. They differ from Stalin's camps not in regime, but in the composition of their population. There are no longer millions and millions of 58s, but there are still millions inside. And just as before, many of them helpless victims of perverted justice, swept in simply to keep the system operating and well fed. Rulers change, the archipelago remains. It remains because that particular political regime could not survive without it. If it disbanded the archipelago, it would cease to exist itself. Every story must have an end. It must be broken off somewhere. To the best of our modest and inadequate ability, we have followed the history of the archipelago from the crimson volleys which greeted its birth to the pink mists of rehabilitation. In the glorious period of leniency and disarray on the eve of Khrushchev's measures to make the camps harsher again, on the eve of a new criminal code, let us consider our story ended. Other historians will appear. Historians who, to their sorrow, know the Khrushchev and post-Khrushchev's camps better than we do. 2 have in fact appeared already, S. Karavansky and Anatoly Marchenko, and they will float to the surface in great numbers, because soon, very soon, the era of publicity will arrive in Russia. Marchenko's book, for instance, fills with pain and horror even the heart of an old camp hand, inured to suffering as it is. In its description of prison conditions today, it gives us a jail of a still newer type than the one of which my own witnesses speak. We learn that the horn, the second horn of imprisonment, as mentioned in Part 1, Chapter 12, juts more boldly, sticks in the prisoner's neck more sharply than ever. By comparing the buildings of the Vladimir Central Prison, the Tsarist and the Soviet buildings, Marchenko shows concretely where the analogy with the Tsarist period of Russian history breaks down. The Tsarist building is dry and warm, the Soviet building damp and cold. Your ears may get frostbitten in your cell, padded jackets are never taken off. The windows of the Tsarist buildings are blocked with 4 layers of Soviet bricks, and don't forget the muzzles. The NKVD men are a power in the land, and they will never give way of their own free will. If they stood their ground in 1956, they can certainly hold out a bit longer. It isn't just the corrective labor organs, it isn't just the Ministry for Protection of Public Order. We have seen already how eagerly newspapers and deputies of the Supreme Soviet support them, because they are the backbone of so many things. They have strength, but that is not all. They have arguments too. Debate with them is not so easy. I have tried it. Not that I ever meant to, but those letters drove me to it. Letters from today's natives which took me completely by surprise. The natives looked at me in hope and begged me to tell their story, to defend them, to make them human again. But tell whom? Supposing that anyone will listen to me, if we had a free press, I would publish all this. There, it's all out in the open. Now let's discuss it. As things are at present, January 1964, I wander around the corridors of institutions, a secret and timid suppliant, bow my head in the hatches through which passes are issued, feel upon myself the disapproving and suspicious stare of the soldiers on duty. How hard a writer and commentator on public affairs must work, before busy government officials will do him the honor, will condescend to lend him an ear for half an hour. But even this is not the greatest difficulty. My greatest difficulty is just what it was all that time at the foreman's meeting in Ekibastas. What can I talk to them about? And in what language? To speak any of my real thoughts, as set out in this book, would be both dangerous and completely hopeless. Why lose my head in the hushed privacy of an inner office, unheard by the public, unbeknown to all who long to hear it, and without advancing the cause a single millimeter? How, then, can I speak, as I cross their mirror-like marble thresholds, go up their softly carpeted stairways? I must voluntarily trammel myself with silken threads drawn through my tongue, my ears, my eyelids, and then stitched to my shoulders, the skin of my back and my belly. I must at my very least voluntarily accept two things. Number 1, all praise to the party, for our whole past, present, and future, which means that our general penal policy cannot be wrong. I dare not express my doubts as to whether the archipelago need ever have existed, and I must not maintain that the majority are inside for no good reason. Number 2, the high-ranking personages with whom I shall be talking are dedicated to their work and concerned for the prisoners. They must not be accused of insincerity, coldness, or ignorance. If a man puts his whole heart into a job, how can he possibly not know all about it? Much more dubious are my motives in interfering. What am I up to? Why me when I have no official duty to perform? Perhaps I have some dirty ends of my own. Why must I meddle when the party sees everything, and will get it all right with no assistance from me? To make my position look a little stronger, I choose the month of my nomination for a Lenin Prize, and I make my move, like a pawn of some importance. He may yet go up in the world and become a rook. Supreme Soviet of the USSR Legislative Proposals Commission. I discover that it has been engaged for some years in drafting a new corrective labor code, a code that is to govern the whole future life of the archipelago, replacing the 1933 code, which existed and yet never existed, which might as well never have been written. And now they have arranged to see me so that I, an alumnus of the archipelago, can acquaint myself with their wisdom, and put before them my own trumpery notions. They are 8 in number. 4 of them are surprisingly young, boys who may just about have had time to complete their higher education, and then again may not. How quickly they are rising to positions of power! They look so much at home in this marble-floored palace, to which I was admitted with great precautions. The chairman of the commission is Ivan Andreevich Badukin, an elderly man who seems infinitely good-natured. His looks seem to say that, if it depended on him, he would disband the archipelago tomorrow. But his role is this, to take a back seat and say nothing throughout our conversation. The real beasts of prey are 2 little old men, just like those old men in Griboyedov, who remembered Ochkov taken and Tartary subdued, set fast in postures adopted long ago. I will take my oath that they have not even opened a newspaper since March 5, 1953. So sure is it that nothing capable of influencing their views can ever happen. One of them wears a blue coat, and I imagine that it is some sort of uniform worn at Catherine's court. I can even distinguish the mark left when he unpinned Catherine's silver star, which must have half covered his chest. Both old men totally disapprove of me and my visit from the moment I cross the threshold, but they are determined to make a show of tolerance. It's never harder to speak than when you have too much to say. Besides, I have all these threads stitched onto me, and I feel them with every movement I make. Still, I have my main harangue ready, and I anticipate no painful tugs at the strings. I speak as follows. Where does the idea come from? I pretend to assume that it is not theirs, that the prison camps are in danger of becoming health resorts, and that, unless a camp is garrisoned by cold and hunger, blessed ease will enthrone itself there. I ask them, in spite of their defective personal experience, to try and imagine the densely ringed stockade of privations and punishments which is the reality of imprisonment. A man is deprived of his native place. He lives with men with whom he has no wish to live. He wants to live with his family and friends, but cannot. He does not see his children growing up. He is deprived of his normal surroundings, his home, his belongings, right down to his wristwatch. His name is disgraced and forgotten. He is deprived of freedom of movement, denied as a rule even the possibility of working at his own trade. He feels the constant pressure of strangers, some of them hostile to him, of other prisoners whose background, outlook, and habits are different from his, denied the softening influence of the other sex, not to mention the physical deprivation, and even the medical attention he gets is incomparably poorer. In what way does this resemble a Black Sea sanatorium? Why are they so much afraid of the health resort jibe? No, this thought doesn't bowl them over. They aren't rocked in their chairs by it. So I broaden my theme. Do we or do we not want to restore these people to society? If we do, why do we make them live like outcasts? Why is the whole content of our disciplinary regimes the systematic humiliation and physical exhaustion of prisoners? What advantage is it to the state to make cripples of them? So I've unburdened myself, and they start showing me where I am wrong. I have no real idea of what the present contingent is like. I judge from old impressions. I'm behind the times. Yes, this is my weak spot. I cannot indeed see who is inside now. For habitual criminals sentenced to close confinement, all the things in my life are no privation at all. The present disciplinary regimes are the only thing that can teach them sense. Two painful jerks at my strings. They are the experts here. They know best who is inside. Restore them to society? Yes, of course, the old men say in wooden voices. And what I hear is, no, of course, let them all die. It'll make our lives easier, and yours too. The disciplinary regimes? One of the veterans of Ochakov, a public prosecutor, the one in blue, with a star on his chest and sparse ringlets of gray hair, who even looks a little like Suvorov. We have already begun to see a return from the introduction of strict regimes. Instead of 2,000 murders a year, here it can be said there are only a few dozen. An important figure. I make a discreet note of it. This appears to be the most useful result of my visit. Who is inside? Of course, to argue about prison regimes, you have to know who is inside. Dozens of psychologists and lawyers would have to go and talk to prisoners without obstruction. Then we should be in a position to argue. This is just one thing my camp correspondents never put in their letters, why they and their comrades are inside. The general part of our discussion is at an end, and we turn to particulars. The Commission, of course, has no doubts, and has already made up its mind about everything. I can be of no use to them. They were merely curious to know what I look like. Parcels? Only 5 kilograms at a time, and at the same intervals as at present. I suggest that they should at least double the number allowed, and make the parcels 8 kilograms each. They're hungry in there. Starvation is no way to reform criminals. What do you mean, hungry? The Commission's indignation is unanimous. We've been there ourselves, and seen leftover bread carried out of a camp by the truckload. For the warden's pigs, you mean? What can I do? Shout, "You're lying! That just can't be true!" But I feel a painful tug at my tongue, attached to a thread running over my shoulders to a place behind my back. I must not violate our working assumptions. They are well informed, they are sincere, they care. Shall I show them the letters from my zeks? It would all be Greek to them, and the well-thumbed, crumpled scraps of paper would look absurd and contemptible on the red velvet tablecloth. But it costs the state nothing to allow more parcels. Ah, but who will benefit from them, they retort. Mainly rich families. They use the word rich. Realistic discussion of policy cannot do without it. Those who have a lot of stolen goods hidden outside, so that by increasing the number of parcels we should put working families at a disadvantage. Now the threads are cutting and tearing. This is an unchallengeable assumption. The interests of the toiling strata are above everything else. They are, of course, only sitting here for the good of the toiling strata. I find myself at a loss for an answer. I don't know what retort I can make. I could say, I'm not convinced, and a fat lot they would care. What do they think I am, their boss or something? I keep pushing. What about the shops? Where does the socialist principle of remuneration come in? If a man's earned something, give it to him. They hit back. He has to build up reserves for when he is released. Otherwise, when he gets out, he becomes a charge in the state. The interests of the state come first. That's stitched on my back. I dare not tug at it. Nor can I suggest that prisoners' wages should be raised at the state's expense. Well, at least let their Sundays off be sacrosanct. That's provided for. They are. But there are dozens of ways of ruining a Sunday in camp. Say expressly that no one must do so. We can't include such minute regulations in the code. The camps work an 8-hour day. I half-heartedly put it to them that 7 hours is enough. But in my own mind, I know that this is impertinence. It isn't a 12 or a 10-hour day. Will you never be satisfied? Correspondence gives the prisoner a feeling of participation in the life of our socialist society. Such were the arguments that I had taught myself to use. Why restrict it? But they cannot reconsider. The allowance is fixed, and not so harshly as in our day. They show me also the schedule of visits, including private 3-day visits, and we, of course, had none at all for our years, so this seems tolerable. Indeed, the arrangements for visits seem quite generous to me, and I barely restrain myself from praising them. I am tired. I am completely sewn up. I can't stir a muscle. I'm doing no good here. It is time to go. And indeed, seen from this bright festive room, from these comfortable armchairs, from the accompaniment of their smoothly flowing eloquence, the camps look not horrible, but quite rational. You see, leftover bread by the truckload. Well, would you let these terrible people loose on the community? I remember the master's thieves and their ugly mugs. It's 10 years since I was in myself. How can I begin to guess who is there now? My sort, the politicals, are supposed to have been freed. The national groups have been released. The other disagreeable old man wants my views on hunger strikes. Surely I cannot disapprove of forced feeding if the food given is more nourishing than gruel. I get up on my hind legs and bellow at them that the Zek has every right not only to go on a hunger strike, his only means of self-defense, but to starve himself to death. My arguments seem crazy to them, but I'm all sewn up. I cannot talk about the connection between hunger strikes and public opinion in the country at large. I leave, feeling tired and jaded. I even feel a little less sure of myself, whereas they are not the least bit shaken. They will do just as they please, and the Supreme Soviet will confirm it unanimously. Vadim Stepanovich Tikhonov, Minister for the Protection of Public Order. What wild fantasy is this? Can I, the miserable convict SCCH 232, be on my way to teach the Minister of Internal Affairs how to run the archipelago? On the approaches to the minister, nothing but colonels, bullet-headed, sleekly pallid, but very agile. No door leads on beyond the chief secretary's room. Where it should be stands an enormous mirror-fronted cupboard, with gathered silk curtains behind the glass, big enough to take 2 men on horseback. And this turns out to be the vestibule of the minister's sanctum. His office would seat 200 comfortably. The minister himself is unhealthily fat, with a heavy jaw. His face is a trapezium, broadening toward the chin. Throughout the conversation, his manner is strictly official. He hears me out as a matter of duty, but with no sign of interest. I launch at him the same old tirade about health resorts. And once again, the same old questions. Is it our common aim, his and mine, to reform the Zeks? My views on reform are behind us in Part 4. Why the sharp change of course in 1961? Why those 4 camp regimes? I repeat boring things for him, all the things I have written in this chapter, about diet, camp shops, parcels, clothing, work, bullying wardens, the mentality of the practical workers. I have chosen not to bring the letters in case someone here pounces on them, and have simply copied out excerpts, omitting the authors' names. I go on talking to him for 40 minutes or an hour. It seems a very long time anyway, and I am surprised myself that he is listening to me. He interrupts now and then, but only to accept or reject some statement outright. He does not attempt a crushing refutation. I was expecting a blank wall of arrogance, but he is much softer. He agrees with much of what I say. He agrees that shopping money must be increased, and that there should be more parcels, and that there is no need to define the content of parcels as minutely as the Legislative Proposals Commission does. But this does not depend on him. The new Corrective Labor Code, not the minister, will decide these things. He agrees that prisoners should be allowed to boil or bake food that they have acquired themselves, except that they never have any, and that there should be no limit on letters and printed material sent through the mails, though this would put a great burden on the camp censorship. He is even against martinets who overdo drills and lineups, but it wouldn't be tactful to interfere. It's easy to wreck discipline, difficult to impose it. He agrees that the grass in the camp area should not be weeded out. What had happened in Dubrovnik around the engineering workshops was quite another matter. They had planted little kitchen gardens. The machine operators busied themselves there during their break, and each man had 2 or 3 square meters sown with tomatoes or cucumbers. But the minister ordered them to dig it all under, to destroy it at once, and he's proud of it. I tell him that man's ties with the earth have a moral importance, and he tells me that individual garden plots foster property-owning instincts. The minister even shudders at the thought that people had been sent back behind the wire after living outside. I don't like to ask what his position was at the time and what he did to prevent it. More than all this, the minister acknowledges that Zeks are kept in harsher conditions now than in the days of Ivan Denisovich. This being so, I need not waste my time persuading him. There is nothing for us to discuss, and it is pointless for him to take note of suggestions from someone with no official position. What can I suggest? Breaking up the whole archipelago? And letting prisoners live without guards? I can't get the words out. It's utopian, and anyway, the solution of a big problem never depends on a single individual. It winds snake-like through the many departments, and it is at home in none. On the other hand, the minister is emphatically sure that the striped uniform for habitual criminals is necessary. If you only knew what sort of people they are. My critical remarks about warders and convoy troops simply offend him. You are confused, or else your own experiences have given you a peculiar way of looking at things. He assures me that you can no longer round up recruits for the prison service because the old privileges have been done away with. It shows a healthy attitude on the part of ordinary people if they won't join up, I almost exclaim. But I feel a warning tug of the strings at my ears, my eyelids, my tongue. However, I am overlooking something. It's only sergeants and corporals who won't join. You can't keep the officers out. They have to make use of conscripts. Contradicting me again, the minister tells me that only prisoners use vulgar abuse, while warders are invariably correct in their manner of speaking to prisoners. When there is such a discrepancy between the letters of insignificant Zeks and the words of a minister, whom shall we believe? Clearly the prisoners are lying. He even quotes his own observations at first hand, because he, of course, does see something of the camps, and I do not. Perhaps I would like to visit one. Kryukovo, or Dubrovnik. These 2 names come to him so easily that they are obviously Potemkin structures. Besides, In what capacity would I go? As a ministry inspector? If I did, I couldn't look the Zeks in the face. I refuse. The minister, disagreeing with me, expresses the views that Zeks lack feeling and do not respond to the efforts made for them. You go to the Magnitogorsk colony and ask, "Any complaints about your treatment?" And with the head of the camp division standing by, would you believe it, they shout out, in chorus, "None!" Now for what the minister sees as splendid results of the re-education program in the camps. A machine operator's pride when the head of his camp division commended him. The pride of prisoners whose work, they made kettles, was destined for heroic Cuba. The reports and elections of internal orders sections, that is, a bitch went walking. The abundance of flowers, provided by the state, in Dubrovlag. His main concern is to create in every camp an industrial base of its own. The minister reckons that by increasing the number of interesting jobs, he can cut out escape attempts. When I object that all human beings long for freedom, he simply doesn't understand. I left with the weary conviction that there was no end to it, that I had not advanced my cause by a hairbreadth, and that they would always take a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I left depressed by the realization that two human minds could think so differently. Zek will understand minister when he ensconces himself in a ministerial sanctum, and minister will understand Zek when he too goes behind the wire, has his own garden plot trodden down, and, in return for his freedom, is offered the chance to master a machine. Institute for the Study of Origins of Criminality. This was an interesting discussion with two cultured deputy directors and several members of the research staff, lively people, each with his own opinions given to arguing amongst themselves. Afterward, V.N. Kudryavtsev, one of the deputy directors, chided me as he led me along the corridor. "It's all very well, but you don't take all points of view into account. Now, Tolstoy would have done so." And suddenly I found that he had tricked me into taking a wrong turn. "We'll just look in and meet the director, Igor Ivanovich Karpets." This visit was not part of the plan. We'd finished our discussion. What was the point of it? Well, all right. I'll drop in to shake hands. I need not have expected a polite exchange of greetings here. It was hard to believe that the deputy directors and heads of section I had seen worked for a boss like this, that he presided over all their research. The most important thing about him, I would learn much later, Karpets was vice president of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. The man who rose to meet me was hostile and disdainful. As I remember it, we remained on our feet throughout our 5-minute conversation, as if he were reluctantly granting an interview for which I had begged and pleaded. In his face, I saw well-fed prosperity, firmness, and distaste for me. With no thought for his nice suit, he had pinned a large badge on his chest as though it were a medal, a vertical sword piercing something down below, over the legend MVD. This appears to be a very important badge. It shows that the wearer has had clean hands, fire in his heart, and a cool head, much longer than most. "Let's have it then. What have you been talking about?" he asks with a scowl. I have no use for him at all, but out of politeness I repeat some of it. "Oh, that," says the Democratic lawyer, as though he had heard enough. "Liberalization, eh? Babying the Zeks?" Then suddenly out they come, full answers to all the questions which I had carried in vain over marble floors and between mirrored walls. Raise the living standard of prisoners? Can't be done, because the free people around the camp would be living less well than the Zeks, which cannot be allowed. Receive parcels frequently, and bigger ones? Can't be done, because this would have a bad effect on the warders, who get no food from Moscow shops. Reprimand warders, and teach them to behave better? Can't be done. We're trying to hold on to them. Nobody wants a job, we can't pay much, and some of their privileges have been taken away. We deny prisoners payment for their work according to socialist principles? Their own fault. They've cut themselves off from our socialist society. But don't we want to reclaim them for normal life? Reclaim them? The sword-bearer is astonished. That's not what the camps are about. A camp is a place of retribution. Retribution. The word fills the whole room. Retribution! Retribution! The sword stands upright. To smite, to pierce. You'll never ease it out again. Retribution. The archipelago was. The archipelago remains. And the archipelago will stand forever. Without it, who can be made to suffer for the errors of the vanguard doctrine, for the fact that people will not grow into the shapes devised for them? The Gulag Archipelago. Part 7, Chapter 3. The Law Today. The reader has seen throughout this book that from the very beginning of the Stalin age, there have been no politicals in our country. The crowds, the millions driven past while you watched, all those millions of 58s, were merely common criminals. Besides, merry, mouthy Nikita Sergeyevich took so many bows from so many platforms. Politicals? Not a one. We just don't have them. And as grief grew forgetful, as distance softened craggy contours, as fat formed under the skin, we almost believed it. Even former Zeks did. Millions of Zeks were released for all to see, so perhaps there really were no politicals left. We had returned, others joined us, our friends and families were back. The gaps in our little world of urban intellectuals seemed to be filled. The ring closed. You could sleep undisturbed, and no one would have been taken from the house when you awoke. Friends would telephone, no one was missing. Not that we altogether believed it, but for practical purposes we accepted that there were no longer any politicals in jail. Well, yes, even today, 1968, a few hundred Balts are not allowed to go home to their republics, and the curse has not been lifted from the Crimean Tatars, but very soon, no doubt. From outside, as always, as indeed under Stalin, all was clean and tidy, nothing showed. And Nikita was there, glued to his platform. There can be no return to deeds and occurrences such as these, either in the party or in the country generally. May 22nd, 1959. That was before Novocherkassk. Now everyone in our country can breathe freely, with no need to worry about the present or the future. March 8th, 1963. After Novocherkassk. Novocherkassk, a town of fateful significance in Russia's history. As though the Civil War had not left scars enough, it thrust itself beneath the saber yet again. Novocherkassk, a whole town of rebels, and every trace is licked clean and hidden. Even under Khrushchev, the fog of universal ignorance remained so thick that no one abroad got to know about Novocherkassk, and there were no Western broadcasts to inform us of it, and even local rumor was stamped out before it could spread, so that the majority of our fellow citizens did not know what event is associated with the name Novocherkassk and the date June 2nd, 1962. Let me put down here all that I have been able to gather. We can say without exaggeration that this was a turning point in the modern history of Russia. If we leave out the Ivanovo weavers at the beginning of the 30s, theirs was a large-scale strike, but it ended without violence. The flare-up at Novocherkassk was the first time the people had spoken out in 41 years, since Kronstadt and Tambov. Unorganized, leaderless, unpremeditated, it was the cry from the soul of a people who could no longer live as they had lived. On Friday, June 1st, one of those carefully considered enactments of which Khrushchev was so fond was published throughout the Union, raising the prices of meat and butter. On that very same day, as demanded by another and quite separate economic plan, piece rates at the huge electric locomotive works in Novocherkassk were lowered, in some cases by 30%. That morning, the workers in two shops, the forge and the foundry, usually obedient creatures of habit geared to their jobs, could not force themselves to work. So hot had things become for them. Their loud, excited discussions developed into a spontaneous mass meeting, an everyday event in the West, an extraordinary one for us. Neither the engineers nor the chief engineer himself could persuade them. Kurochkin, the works manager, arrived. When the workers asked him, "What are we going to live on now?" this well-fed parasite answered, "You're used to guzzling meat pies, put jam in them instead." He and his retinue barely escaped being torn to pieces. Perhaps if he had answered differently, it would all have blown over. By noon the strike had spread throughout the enormous locomotive works. Runners were sent to other factories where the workers wavered but did not come out in support. The Moscow-Rostov railway line runs close to the works, either to make sure that the news would reach Moscow more quickly, or to prevent troops and tanks from moving in. A large number of women sat down on the tracks to hold up trains, whereupon the men began pulling up the rails and building barriers. Strike action of such boldness is unusual in the history of the Russian workers' movement. Slogans appeared on the works building. "Down with Khrushchev! Use Khrushchev for sausage meat!" While all this was happening, troops and police began converging on the works, which stands, with its settlement, 3 to 4 kilometers from Novocherkassk, across the river Tuzlov. Tanks took up position on the bridge over the Tuzlov. From evening until following morning, movement inside the city or across the bridge was completely forbidden. Even during the night, the workers' settlement did not quiet down for a moment. Overnight, about 30 workers were arrested as ringleaders and carried off to the city police station. On the morning of June 2nd, some other enterprises in the town struck, but by no means all of them. Another spontaneous mass meeting at NEVZ decided on a protest march into the town to demand the release of the arrested workers. The procession, only about 300 strong to begin with, you had to be brave, with women and children in its ranks, carrying portraits of Lenin and peaceful slogans, marched over the bridge past the tanks without obstruction, then uphill into the town. Here their numbers quickly swelled by curious onlookers, individual workers from other enterprises, and little boys. At several places in the city, people stopped lorries and used them as platforms for speech-making. The whole town was seething. The NEVZ demonstrators marched along the main street, Moskovskaya, and some of them began to break down the locked doors of the town police station in the belief that their arrested comrades were inside. They were met with pistol shots. Further on, the street led to the Lenin Monument, and by two narrow paths around the public garden to the headquarters of the town party committee, formerly the Ataman's place, in which General Kalidin had shot himself in 1918. All the streets were choked with people, and here, on the square, the crowd was densest. Many little boys had climbed into trees in the garden to get a better view. The party offices were found to be empty. The city authorities had fled to Rostov. Inside the building there was broken glass, and the floors were strewn with documents, as they must have been after a retreat in the Civil War. A couple of dozen workers walked through the palace, came out on its long balcony, and harangued the crowd in halting speeches. It was about 11 a.m. There were no police to be seen in the town, but there were more and more troops. A revealing picture. At the first light shock, the civil authorities hid behind the army. Soldiers had occupied the post office, the radio station, the bank. By this time, the whole of Novocherkassk was beleaguered, and every entry and exit barred. For this task, they had brought in, among others, cadets from the officers' training schools in Rostov, leaving some behind to patrol that city. Tanks crawled slowly along Moskovskaya Street, following the route the demonstrators had taken toward party headquarters. Boys started scrambling onto the tanks and obstructing the observation slits. The tanks fired a few blank shells, rattling the windows of shops and houses all along the street. The boys scattered, and the tanks crawled on. And the students? Novocherkassk is, of course, a town of students. Where were they all? The students of some institutes, including the Polytechnic, and of some technical secondary schools, had been locked in their dormitories or in other school buildings from early morning. Their rectors had thought quickly. But we may as well say it, the students for their part showed little civic courage. They were, presumably, glad of this excuse to do nothing. It would take more than the turn of a key to hold back rebel students in the West today, and took more in Russia in days gone by. A scuffle broke out inside the party building. Step by step, the speakers were dragged back inside and soldiers emerged onto the balcony, more and more of them. Remember how the military observed the Kengir mutiny from the balcony of the Steplag head office? A file of riflemen began forcing the crowd back from the small square immediately before the palace, toward the railings of the garden. Several witnesses say unanimously that these soldiers were all non-Russians, Caucasians brought in from the other end of the oblast to replace the cordon from the local garrison previously posted there. But not all witnesses agree that the previous cordon had been ordered to open fire, and that the order was not carried out because the captain who received it killed himself in front of his men rather than pass it on. That an officer committed suicide is beyond doubt, but accounts of the circumstances are vague and no one knows the name of this hero of conscience. The crowd backed away, but no one expected the worst. It is not known who gave the order, but these soldiers raised their rifles and fired a first volley over the heads of the crowd. Perhaps General Plyev had no immediate intention of firing on the crowd. Perhaps the situation got out of hand. The burst fired over the head of the crowd, found the trees in the little garden, and the boys who had climbed into them, some of whom fell onto the ground. The crowd, it seems, gave a roar, whereupon the soldiers, whether at a command or because they saw red or in panic, started firing freely into the crowd, and, yes, with dum-dum bullets. Remember Kengir, the 16 at the guardhouse? The crowd fled in panic, jamming the narrow paths around the garden, but the troops went on firing at their backs as they retreated. They continued firing until the large square beyond the garden at the Lenin statue was completely empty, all along the former Platovsky Prospect, and as far as Moskovskaya Street. An eyewitness says that the area looked like one great mound of corpses, but many of those lying there were of course only wounded. Information from a variety of sources is more or less unanimous that some 70 or 80 people were killed. The soldiers looked around for lorries and buses, commandeered them, loaded them with the dead and the wounded, and dispatched them to the high-walled military hospital. For a day or two afterward, these buses went around with blood-stained seats. That day, just as in Kengir, movie cameras took pictures of the rebels on the streets. The firing ceased, the terror passed, the crowd poured back into the square, and was fired upon again. All this happened between noon and 1 p.m. This is what an observant witness saw at 2 p.m. There are about 8 tanks of different types standing on the square in front of the party headquarters. A cordon of soldiers stands before them. The square is almost deserted. There are only small groups of people, mostly youngsters, standing about and shouting at the soldiers. On the square, puddles of blood have formed in the depressions in the pavement. I am not exaggerating. I never suspected till now that there could be so much blood. The benches in the public garden are spattered with blood. There are bloodstains on its sanded paths, and on the whitewashed tree trunks in the public garden. The whole square is scored with tank tracks. A red flag, which the demonstrators had been carrying, is propped against the wall of party headquarters, and a gray cap splashed with red-brown blood has been slung over the top of its pole. Across the facade of the party building hangs a red banner. There, for some time past, "The people and the party are one." People go up to the soldiers, to curse them or to appeal to their conscience. How could you do it? Who did you think you were shooting at? Your own people you were shooting at. They make excuses. It wasn't us. We've only just been brought in and posted here. We had nothing to do with it. That's how efficient our murderers are. And yet people talk about bureaucratic sluggishness. Those soldiers have already been taken away, and perplexed Russians put in their place. He knows his business, that General Pliev. Towards 5 or 6 o'clock, the square garden gradually filled with people again. They were brave, the people of Novocherkassk. The town radio kept appealing to them. "Citizens, do not fall for provocation. Go home quietly." The riflemen still stood there. The blood had not been mopped up, and again they pressed forward. Shouts from the crowd, more and more people, and another impromptu meeting. They knew now that 6 senior members of the Central Committee had flown in, probably arriving before the first shootings. Among them, needless to say, Mikoyan, the expert on Budapest-type situations, and Frol Kozlov. The names of the other 4 are not known for certain. They stayed in the KUKKS building, formerly the headquarters of the Cadet Corps, as though it were a fortress, and a delegation of younger workers from NEVZ was sent to tell them what had happened. A buzz went through the crowd. "Let Mikoyan come down here. Let him see all this blood for himself." Mikoyan wouldn't come down, thank you, but a reconnaissance helicopter flew low over the square around 6 o'clock, inspected it, flew off again. Shortly afterward, the workers' delegation came back from KUKKS. As agreed, the military cordon let the delegates through, and officers escorted them to the balcony of the party building. The delegates reported to the crowd that they had seen the Central Committee members and told them about this bloody Saturday, and that Kozlov had wept when he had heard the children falling from the trees at the first volley. You know Frol Kozlov, the Leningrad Party gang boss, the cruelest of Stalinists. He wept. The Central Committee members had promised to investigate these events and severely punish those responsible. The very promises made to us in Osoblag. But for the present, everyone must go home to prevent the outbreak of fresh disorders in the town. The meeting, however, did not disperse. The crowd grew ever denser toward the evening. The desperate courage of Novocherkassk. There is a story that the Politburo team made the decision that evening to deport the whole population of the town, every last one of them. I can believe this. It would have been nothing extraordinary after the deportation of nations. Wasn't the same Mikoyan close to Stalin when that happened? Around 9 in the evening, they tried to drive people away from the palace with tanks. But as soon as the drivers switched on their engines, people clustered around the tanks, blocking the hatches and the observation slits. The tanks stalled. The riflemen stood by and made no effort to help the tank crews. An hour later, tanks and armored personnel carriers appeared from the opposite side of the square, with an escort of Tommy gunners perched on top of them. Our battle experience counts for something. We are the ones who defeated the fascists. Advancing at high speed to the jeers of the young people on the footpaths, the students had been released toward the evening. They cleared the roadways of Moskovskaya Street and the former Platovsky Prospect. At last, toward midnight, the riflemen began firing tracer bullets into the air, and the crowd slowly dispersed. What power there is in a popular disturbance! How quickly it changes the whole political situation! The night before there had been a curfew, and people had been frightened anyway, but now the whole town was strolling about and hooting at the soldiers. A people transformed. Can it be so near to breaking through the crust of this half-century? Into a completely different atmosphere? On June 3rd, the town radio broadcast speeches by Mikoyan and Kozlov. Kozlov did not weep. Nor did they any longer promise to find the culprits, those in higher places. What they now said was that these events were the result of enemy provocation, and that these enemies would be severely punished. The people had of course gone from the square by now. Mikoyan said further that dum-dum bullets had never been adopted as part of the equipment of Soviet troops, and that they must therefore have been used by enemies of the state. But who were these enemies? How had they parachuted into the country? Where were they hiding? Show us just one. We are so used to being treated like fools. Enemies, they say, and all is explained. In the Middle Ages it was devils. The shops were immediately the richer for butter, sausage, and many other things not seen in these parts for a long time, or anywhere outside the capitals. The wounded all vanished without trace. Not one of them went home. Instead, the families of the wounded and the killed, who of course wanted to know what had become of their kin, were deported to Siberia. So were many of those involved in the demonstration who had been noticed or photographed. Some participants were dealt with in a series of trials in camera. There were also 2 public trials, with entry by ticket for factory party officials and for the town apparatchiki. At one of these, 9 men were sentenced to be shot and 2 women to 15 years imprisonment. The membership of the town party committee remained as before. On the Saturday following Bloody Saturday, the town radio announced that the workers of the electric locomotive works have solemnly undertaken to fulfill their 7-year plan ahead of time. If the Tsar had not been such a ninny, he would have realized that all he needed to do on January 9th in Petersburg was hunt down the workers carrying banners and pin charges of banditry on them. After that, there would have been no revolutionary movement worth mentioning. At Alexandrovo in 1961, a year before Novocherkassk, the police beat a man to death while he was under arrest and then would not allow his body to be carried past their precinct to the cemetery. The crowd was furious and burned down the police station. Arrests followed immediately. There was a similar incident about the same time in Morum. Under Stalin, even a tailor who stuck a needle in a newspaper could get Article 58. Now, a more sensible view is taken. Wrecking a police station should not be regarded as a political act. It was ordinary banditry. Instructions were handed down to this effect. Quote, mass disorders, unquote, should be treated as political offenses. If they are not political, what is? So, all at once, there were no more politicals. But one stream has never dried up in the USSR, and still flows. A stream of criminals, untouched by the beneficent waves summoned to life, etc. A stream which flowed uninterruptedly through all those decades, whether Leninist norms were infringed or strictly observed, and flowed into Khrushchev's day more furiously than ever. I mean the believers. Those who resisted the new wave of cruel persecution, the wholesale closing of churches, monks who were slung out of their monasteries. Krasnov-Levitin has given us a great deal of information about this. Stubborn sectarians, especially those who refused to perform military service. There's nothing we can do about it, we're really very sorry, but you're directly aiding imperialism. We let you off lightly nowadays. It's 5 years first time around. These are in no sense politicals. They are religionists, but still they have to be re-educated. Believers must be dismissed from their jobs merely for their faith. Komsomols must be sent along to break the windows of believers. Believers must be officially compelled to attend anti-religious lectures. Church doors must be cut down with blowtorches. Domes pulled down with hawsers attached to tractors. Gatherings of old women broken up with fire hoses. Is this what you mean by dialogue, French comrades? As the monks of the Pokayev monastery were told in the Soviet of Workers' Deputies, if we always observe Soviet laws, we shall have to wait a long time for communism. Only in extreme cases, when educational methods do not help, is recourse to the law necessary. Here we can dazzle the world with the diamond pure nobility of our laws today. We no longer try people in closed courts, as under Stalin. We no longer try them in absentia. We try them semi-publicly, that is to say, in the presence of a semi-public. I hold in my hand a record of the trial of some Baptists at Nikitovka in the Donbass in January 1964. This is how it's done. On the pretense that their identity must be checked, the Baptists who arrived to attend the trial were held in jail for 3 days, until the trial was over and to give them a fright. Someone, a free citizen, who threw flowers to the defendants got 10 days. So did a Baptist who kept a record of the trial, and his notes were taken away, but another record survived. And a bunch of hand-picked Kosomols were let in before the general public by a side door, so that they could occupy the front rows. While the trial was in progress, there were shouts from the spectators, "Pour kerosene over the lot and set fire to them!" The court did nothing to curb this righteous indignation. Typical of its procedures, it admitted the evidence of hostile neighbors, and also that of terrorized minors. Little girls of 9 and 11 were brought before the court. Who the hell cares what effect it has on them as long as we get our verdict? Their exercise books, with texts from the scriptures, were introduced as exhibits. One of the defendants, Basby, father of 9 children, was a minor, who had never received any support from the Union Committee at his pit because he was a Baptist. But they managed to confuse his daughter, Nina, a schoolgirl in the 8th grade, and to suborn her with 50 rubles from the Union Committee and a promise to place her in an institute later on, so that during the investigation she made fantastic statements against her father. He had tried to poison her with sour fruit drink. When the believers were hiding in the woods for their prayer meetings, because they were persecuted in the settlement, they had had a radio transmitter, a tall tree with wire wound all around it. Afterward, these lying statements began to prey on Nina's mind. She became mentally ill and was put in the violent ward of an asylum. Nonetheless, she was produced in court in the expectation that she would stick to her evidence, but she repudiated every word of it.
The interrogator dictated what I had to say himself.
It made no difference. The shameless judge ignored her latest statements and regarded only her earlier evidence as valid. Whenever depositions favorable to the prosecution come unstuck, this is the typical and regular dodge used by the courts. They ignore what is brought out in court and base themselves on faked evidence obtained in the preliminary investigation. Now, what do you mean by that? It says here in your deposition, you testified during the investigation. What right have you to retract now? That's an offense too, you know. The judge is not at all interested in the substance of the case, in the truth. The Baptists are persecuted because they do not accept preachers sent by an atheist plenipotentiary of the state, but prefer their own. Under Baptist rules, any brother can preach the gospel. There is a directive from the Oblast Party Committee. Put them on trial and forcibly take their children from them. And this will be carried out, although with its left hand, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet has just, July 2, 1962, signed the World Convention on the Fight Against Discrimination in the Sphere of Education. One of its points is that parents must be allowed to provide for the religious and moral education of their children in accordance with their own convictions. But that is precisely what we cannot allow. Anyone who speaks in court on the substance of a case, anyone who tries to clarify the issue, is invariably interrupted, diverted from his train of thought, deliberately confused by the judge who conducts the debate on this level. How can you talk about the end of the world when we are committed to the building of communism? This is from the closing statement made by one young girl, Zhenka Klapanina. Instead of going to the cinema or to dances, I used to read the Bible and say my prayers, and just for that you took away my freedom from me. Yes, to be free is a great happiness, but to be free from sin is a greater still. Lenin said that only in places outside of Russia did such shameful phenomena such as religious persecution still exist. I've never been in Turkey and know nothing about it, but how things are in Russia you can see for yourselves. She was cut short. The sentences, 2 of them got 5 years in the camps, 2 of them 4 years, and Bazbay, father of all those children, got 3. The defendants accepted their sentences joyfully, and said a prayer. The representatives from Enterprises shouted, "Not long enough! Make it more! Throw kerosene over them and put a match to it!" The long-suffering Baptists took note and kept count, set up a council of prisoners' relatives, which began issuing manuscript bulletins about all the persecutions. From these bulletins, we learn that from 1961 to June 1964, 197 Baptists were condemned, 15 of them women. They are all listed by name. Prisoners' dependents, now left without means of support, have also been counted, 442, of whom 341 are under school age. The majority get 5 years of exile, but some get 5 years in a strict regime camp, narrowly escaping the hardened criminals motley, with 3 to 5 years of exile in addition. B. M. Zdorovets from Olshiny in Kharkov Oblast got 7 years of strict regime for his faith. A 76-year-old Y. V. Arend was put inside, as were the whole Lazovoy family, father, mother, and son. Yevgeny M. Sorokin, a Group 1 disabled veteran of the Fatherland War, was condemned in the village of Sokolovo, Zmievsky district, Kharkov Oblast, to 3 years in a camp for bringing up his children, Lyuba, Nadia, and Raya, as Christians, and they were taken away from him by order of the court. The court trying the Baptist M. I. Brodovsky at Nikolaev, October 6, 1966, was not too squeamish to use crudely faked documents. When the defendant protested, "This is dishonest of you," they barked back at him, "The law will crush you, smash you, destroy you." The law, my friend, not one of your acts of extrajudicial vengeance, as practiced in the years when norms were still observed. We recently got to know S. Karavansky's soul-chilling petition, which was transmitted from a camp to the outside world. The author had been sentenced to 25 years, had served 16 of them, 1944 through 1960, and had been released, evidently under the 2/3 rule. Had married, had begun a university course, but no! In 1965 they came for him again. Get yourself ready, you still have 9 years to go. Where else is this possible? Under what other code of law on earth except ours? They had hung quarters around people's necks like iron collars, sentences which would end sometime in the 70s. Suddenly, a new code is promulgated, 1961, with no sentence higher than 15 years. Even a first-year law student can see that those 25-year sentences are thereby rescinded. Only we do not agree that they are. Yell yourself hoarse, beat your head on the wall if you like. They are not rescinded. We feel, rather, that you should step back inside and finish your time. There are quite a few people like this, people who are not affected by the epidemic of releases under Khrushchev. The teammates, cellmates, transit prison acquaintances whom we left behind. We have long ago forgotten them in our new lives, but they still shuffle hopelessly, drearily, numbly about these same little patches of trampled earth, with the same watchtowers and barbed wire fences all around them. The faces in the papers change, the speeches from the platforms change. People fight against the cult, and then stop fighting, but the 25-year prisoners, Stalin's godchildren, are still inside. Karavansky cites the blood-freezing prison careers of several such people. All you freedom-loving, left-wing thinkers in the West, you left laborites, you progressive American, German, and French students, as far as you are concerned, none of this amounts to much. As far as you are concerned, this whole book of mine is a waste of effort. You may suddenly understand it all someday, but only when you yourselves hear, "Hands behind your backs there," and step ashore on our archipelago. Still, there really is no comparison between the numbers of political prisoners now and in Stalin's time. They are no longer counted in millions or in hundreds of thousands. Is this because the law has been reformed? No, it is just that the ship has changed course, for a time. Courtroom epidemics flare up just as they used to, lightening the labors of the legal brain. Even the newspapers will keep you abreast if you know how to read them. When they start writing about hooligans, you know that the courts are jailing people wholesale on charges of hooliganism. If they write about theft from the state, you know that the fashionable charge is embezzlement. Zeks, writing from today's colonies, tell us despondently that it is useless to try to find justice. What you read in the press is one thing, real life is another. VID. I'm sick of being an outcast from my society and my people, but where can I get justice? The interrogator's word carries more weight than mine. Yet what knowledge or insight can she, a young girl of 23, have? How can she possibly imagine the fate they can send a man to? V.K. The reason they never reopen cases is that if they did, some of them might become redundant. L.N. Stalinist methods of investigation and trial have simply migrated from the political to the criminal sphere, and that's all there is to it. G.S. Let us note carefully what these suffering people have told us. Number 1. Retrial is impossible, because the judicial caste might collapse. Nowadays, they use the criminal clauses to make mincemeat of people, just as they once used Article 58. If they did not, what would they feed on, and what would become of the archipelago? Briefly, suppose one citizen wishes to rid the world of another whom he dislikes, not of course straightforwardly with a knife between his ribs, but legally. What is the surest way of doing it? Formerly, he would have to write a denunciation order under Article 58-10. But now he should begin by consulting the professionals, investigating officers, policemen, court officials. That sort of citizen always has friends of this sort, to find what is in fashion this year. For what type of offender are the nets being laid? In which category are the courts required to increase their yield? Find the appropriate clause, and stick that in him. It's as good as any knife. Thus, a storm of accusations under the rape clause raged for a long time after Nikita, in a heated moment, ordered minimum sentences of 12 years. Thousands of hammers in every locality began busily riveting on 12-year fetters, for the smiths must never stand idle. Now, this clause deals with delicate and very private matters. Weigh it carefully, and you will see that in some ways it resembles Article 58-10. The offenses covered by each are committed tete-a-tete, they are difficult to verify, they are shy of witnesses, and that is just what the courts require. Take the S.V. case. 2 Leningrad women were summoned to the police station. Had they been at a party with some men? Yes. Had sexual intercourse taken place? This had already been established with the aid of a reliable informer. Yes. Right then. Which is it? Did you take part in the sexual act voluntarily or against your will? If voluntarily, we shall have to regard you as prostitutes. You will hand over your passports and get out of Leningrad in 48 hours. If it was against your will, you must bring a charge of rape. The women were not a bit anxious to leave Leningrad, so the men got 12 years each. Our obtuse, our blinkered, our hulking brute of a judicial system can live only if it is infallible. The brute is so strong and so sure of itself only because it never reconsiders its decisions. Because every officer of the court can lay about him as he pleases in the certainty that no one will ever correct him. To this end, there exists a tacit understanding that every complaint, whatever summit of summits you send it to, will be referred back to the very authority of which you are complaining. Let no officer of the court, prosecutor or investigator, be censured for abusing his office, for giving free rein to bad temper or a desire for personal vengeance, for making a mistake, or for misconducting a case. We will cover up for him, protect him, form a wall around him. We are the law, and that is what the law is for. What is the good of beginning an investigation and then not bringing charges? Does this not mean that the interrogator's work is wasted? What is the good of a hearing without a conviction? Wouldn't the People's Court be letting the investigating officer down and wasting his time? What does it mean when an oblast court overturns the decision of a People's Court? It means that the higher court has added another botched job to the oblast record. Think of the discomfort you would be causing your comrades in the profession. What's the point of it? Once begun, as the result of a denunciation, let's say, an investigation must end, without fail, in a conviction, which cannot possibly be quashed. Above all, don't let one another down, and don't let the rake 'em down. Do what they tell you. In return, they will see that you come to no harm. Another very important thing about the courts today, there is no tape recorder, no stenographer, just a thick-fingered secretary with the leisurely penmanship of an 18th century schoolgirl, laboriously recording some part of the proceedings in the transcript. This record is not read out during the session, and no one is allowed to see it until the judge has looked it over and approved it. Only what the judge confirms will remain on record, will have happened in court. While things that we have heard with our own eyes vanish like smoke, they never happened at all. In his mind's eye, the judge can always see the shiny black visage of truth, the telephone in his chambers. This oracle will never fail you as long as you do what it says. Endure and flourish, O noble company of judges. We exist for you, not you for us. May justice be a thick-piled carpet beneath your feet. If it goes well with you, then all is well. The proven reliability of the judicial system makes the lives of the police much easier. It enables them to apply without misgivings the method known as the trailer or the crime sack. Because of the slackness, the inefficiency, the boneheadedness of the local police, crime after crime after crime remains unsolved. But to keep the book straight, criminals must be exposed and cases closed. So they wait for a suitable opportunity. A man lands in the police station, somebody pliant, easily bullied, not too bright, and they saddle him with all these unsolved crimes. He's the one! All this year! The elusive master criminal! Pummel and starve him till he confesses everything, puts his name to it all, earns himself a sentence commensurate with the grand total of his crimes, and so wipe a blot from the district. The health of society is much improved, since no sin goes unpunished, and the police in charge of criminal investigations are given prizes. The health of society has improved still further, and justice has been reinforced in recent years, since the cry went up that parasites should be seized, tried, and deported. This decree was also a partial replacement for the elastic 58-10, now only a memory. Accusations made under it proved just as insidious, just as flimsy, and just as irrefutable. They managed to use it against I. Brodsky, the poet. The meaning of the word was skillfully distorted from the start. Real parasites, highly paid drones, sat on the bench or at their bureaucratic desks, while sentences rained down on paupers with skills and an appetite for work who knocked themselves out trying to earn a bit extra when the working day was over. How viciously, with the underlying hatred of the overfed for the hungry, they fell upon these idlers. Two of Adzubei's unscrupulous journalists had the effrontery to declare that parasites were not being banished far enough from Moscow. They were allowed to receive parcels and money orders from relatives. Discipline was not strict enough. They are not made to work from dawn to dusk. These are their very words, from dawn to dusk. What communist dawn, what constitutional order, we may wonder, can call for such drudgery? We have listed several important streams, which, together with the endless spate of embezzlers, ensure that the archipelago is continually replenished. Nor is it altogether wasted effort for the People's Brigades, those freebooters or stormtroopers commissioned by the militia, unmentioned in the Constitution and free from responsibility before the law, to walk the streets or stay comfortably in their command posts, knocking out teeth of prisoners. Reinforcements flow into the archipelago. And although we have had a classless society for so long, although the glow of the communist conflagration half fills the sky, we are used to the idea that crime never ceases, never decreases, and indeed no one now seems to promise any such thing. In the 1930s, they assured us, we're almost there, just a few more years. They don't even make such statements anymore. The law in our country, in its might and its flexibility, is unlike anything called law elsewhere on earth. The stupid Romans had a formula. The law has no retroactive force. With us it has. An old reactionary proverb may mutter, laws aren't written for what's gone and done. In our country they are. If a modish new decree comes out and the law itches to apply it to persons already in custody, why not? Let it do so. This is what happened to the currency speculators and bribe takers. Lists were sent from, say, Kiev to Moscow, where the names of those whom the law could be retrospectively applied were ticked off, and they were given a longer stretch or promoted to 9 grams of lead accordingly. You might suppose that before a trial takes place, the course of the hearing and the verdict would be unknown. But you may find socialist legality publishing all this before the trial takes place. How can it know? Just ask yourself. Then again, Soviet law has forgotten all about the sin of bearing false witness, and simply does not regard it as a crime. A legion of false witnesses thrives in our midst. They go sedately on their way to an honorable old age, bask in a golden sunset at the end of their days. Ours is the only country in the world, and in history, to pamper perjurers. Then again, Soviet law does not punish murdering judges and murdering prosecutors. They all enjoy honorable careers and live to be noble elders. Then again, no one can deny that Soviet law is capable of those abrupt changes of course, those sudden swerves characteristic of all anxious creative thought. At times, the law veers toward sharp reduction of crime in a single year, arrest fewer, try fewer, release convicted offenders on probation. At other times, it veers in the opposite direction. Evildoers endlessly multiply, no more probation, send more to hard labor and special regime camps, stiffer sentences, execute the villains. Whatever storms may buffet it, the vessel of the law sails smoothly and majestically on. Our Supreme Courts, our Supreme Prosecutors, are old hands, and no gust will take them by surprise. They will conduct their plenary sessions, they will issue their instructions, and every insane change of course will be shown to be a long-felt need, a logical result of our whole historical development, prophetically envisaged in the one true doctrine. The vessel of Soviet law is ready for the sharpest turn. If orders come tomorrow to put millions inside again for their way of thinking, or to deport whole peoples, the same peoples as before, or others, or rebellious towns, or to pin 4 numbers on prisoners again, its mighty hull will scarcely tremble, its stem will not buckle. There remains what Drzhavin tells us, what only those who have experienced it for themselves can feel in their hearts. An unjust court is worse than brigandage. Yes, that remains true. As true as it was under Stalin, and as it was all through the years described in this book. Many fundamental principles, decrees, and laws, contradictory or complementary, have been promulgated and printed, but it is not in accordance with them that our country lives, and that arrests are made, trials held, expert evidence given. Only in those few cases, 15% perhaps, in which the subject of investigation and judicial proceedings affects neither the interests of the state, nor the reigning ideology, nor the personal interests or comfort of some office holder, only very rarely can the officers of the court enjoy the privilege of trying a case without telephoning somebody to seek instructions, of trying it on its merits, and as conscience dictates. All other cases, the overwhelming majority, criminal or civil, it makes no difference, inevitably affect in some important way the interests of the chairman of a kolkhoz or a village soviet, a shop foreman, a factory manager, the head of a housing bureau, a block sergeant, the investigating officer or commander of a police district, the medical superintendent of a hospital, a chief planning officer, the heads of administration or ministries, special sections or personnel sections, the secretaries of district or oblast party committees, and upward, ever upward. In all such cases, calls are made from one discreet inner office to another. Leisurely lowered voices give friendly advice. Steady and steer the decision to be reached in the trial of a wretched little man caught in the tangled schemes, which he would not understand even if he knew them, of those set in authority over him. The naively trusting little newspaper reader goes into the courtroom conscious that he is in the right. His reasonable arguments are carefully rehearsed, and he lays them before the somnolent, mask-like faces on the bench, never suspecting that the sentence has been passed on him already, that there are no courts of appeal, no proper channels, and due procedures through which a malignant, a corrupt, a soul-searingly unjust verdict can be undone. There is only a wall, and its bricks are laid in a mortar of lies. We call this chapter The Law Today. It should rightly be called There Is No Law. The same treacherous secrecy, the same fog of injustice, still hangs in our air, worse than the smoke of city chimneys. For half a century, and more, the enormous state has towered over us, girded with hoops of steel. The hoops are still there. There is no law. End of the Gulag Archipelago, Part 7. The Gulag Archipelago, Afterword. Instead of my writing this book alone, the chapters should have been shared among people with special knowledge, and we should have met in editorial conference and helped each other to put the whole in true perspective. But the time for this was not yet. Those whom I asked to take on particular chapters would not do so, but instead offered stories, written or oral, for me to use as I pleased. I suggested to Varlam Shalamov that we write the whole book together, but he also declined. What was really needed was a well-staffed office, to advertise in the newspapers and on the radio, please reply, to carry on open correspondence, to do what was done with the story of Brest Fortress. Not only could I not spread myself like this, I had to conceal the project itself. My letters, my materials, to disperse them, to do everything in deepest secrecy. I even had to camouflage the time I spent working on the book with what looked like work on other things. As soon as I began the book, I thought of abandoning it. I could not make up my mind. Should I or should I not be writing such a book by myself? And would I have the stamina for it? But when, in addition to what I had collected, prisoners' letters converged on me from all over the country, I realized that since all this had been given to me, I had a duty. I must explain that never once did this whole book in all its parts lie on the same desk at the same time. In September 1965, when work on the archipelago was at its most intensive, I suffered a setback. My archive was raided, and my novel impounded. At this point, the parts of the archipelago already written, and the materials for other parts were scattered, and never reassembled. I could not take the risk, especially when all the names were given correctly. I kept jotting down reminders to myself to check this and remove that, and traveled from place to place with these bits of paper. The jerkiness of the book, its imperfections, are the true mark of our persecuted literature. Take the book for what it is. I have stopped work on the book, not because I regard it as finished, but because I cannot spend any more of my life on it. Besides begging for indulgence, I want to cry aloud. When the time and the opportunity come, gather together, all you friends who have survived and know the story well. Write your own commentaries to go with my book. Correct and add to it where necessary, but do not make it too unwieldy. Do not duplicate what is there already. Only then will the book be definitive. God bless the work. I am surprised to have finished it safely, even in this form. I have several times thought that they would not let me. I am finishing it in the year of a double anniversary, and the two anniversaries are connected. It is 50 years since the revolution which created Gulag, and 100 years since the invention of barbed wire, 1867. This second anniversary will no doubt pass unnoticed. The Gulag Archipelago. P.P.S. I was in a hurry when I wrote what you have just read, because I expected that even if I did not perish in the explosion set off by my letter to the Writers' Congress, I should lose my freedom to write and access to my manuscripts. But as things turned out, I was not only not arrested as a result of the letter, but found myself on a granite footing. I realized then that I must and could complete and correct this book. A few friends have now read it. They have helped me to see the serious defects in it. I did not try it out on a wider circle, and if this ever becomes possible, it will be too late for me. In this last year I have done what I could to improve it. Let no one blame me for its incompleteness. There is no end to the additions which could be made, and every single person who has had the slightest contact with the subject or thought seriously about it will always be able to add something, often something precious. But there are laws of proportion. In size my book has reached its utmost limit. Push in a few more little grains and the whole cliff will come tumbling down. For sometimes expressing myself badly, for repetition in places and loose construction in others, I ask forgiveness. I was not granted a quiet year after all, and during the last few months the ground has been burning under my feet again, and the desk under my hand. Even while preparing this last version, I have never once seen the whole book together, never once had it all on my desk at one time. Of those without whom this book could not have been written, revised, or kept safe, cannot yet be entrusted to paper. They know who they are. They have my homage. End of the Gulag Archipelago.